Nightraveller. You return, drawn back into the shadows of Ashcroft's twisted woods. Yes, welcome to part 2 of the legend of the Whistling Huntsman. Our tale of dread and dark superstition. Last we left him, it was the year 1788, and the city cartographer, Thomas Gray, had ventured into these cursed woods unwisely, dismissing the villagers' warnings. But fate has little tolerance for such pride, and so, in those twisted trees, under the veil of choking fog, we heard it, the piercing whistle, and glimpsed a ghostly light. Lean in now and listen well. Part 2 begins. Thomas Gray, the cartographer from Philadelphia, ventured deeper into the suffocating darkness of the woods surrounding the village of Ashcroft. And when he did, the horrifying, ghostly whistle didn't fade. Instead, it grew sharper, twisting through the trees, rising and falling, with the wind like a ghostly breath. An awful, ghastly shriek. It wasn't just in the air, it was all around him, closer now, relentless. The whistle sounded like it was approaching him, and in the distance he saw something, a faint, pale glow, otherworldly, like a supernatural flame. Unlike anything he had ever seen before. Gray felt it then, a familiar stirring in his gut, twisting, tightening. Slowly it spread, a dull heat creeping upward, settling into a heavy weight in his chest. He was losing his breath now and couldn't catch it. Instinctively, he reached for his compass. He didn't have it. He had left it inside. He was alone. Behind his eyes, a heat gathered, distorting the edges of things, blurring them until the world began to slip away. Gray's vision blurred, and for one terrible moment, he felt himself slipping, his body here, but his mind retreating into some dark, unreachable corner. The fog began to roll in then, thick and writhing as if animated by some dark will of its own. It coiled low to the ground at first, weaving between the roots and creeping over fallen branches before unfurling into the air like tendrils seeking purchase. Gray could see it curling upward, rising in defense, churning waves that climbed the trees, their outlines vanishing under the heavy shroud. The mist thickened as it engulfed him, swirling in strange, unnatural patterns, folding over itself like layers of soiled gauze, pressing in from every direction. Shapes of trees and shadows twisted in the mist, and then he heard voices, distant, distorted, like they came from beneath water. Calls from familiar voices reached out to him. Hook, Pierce, others he could barely place. Perhaps even Eliza, crying his name. but the calls were warped, as though filtered through a hollow bone, echoing in ways that made his stomach drop. He tried to move toward them, but the mist pressed in, cold and heavy, muting his senses. It wasn't just fog. It was something else, a presence, almost alive, winding itself tighter, coiling and knotting back on itself, its movements wrong, unnatural. Gray felt his skin prickle as he watched it shift, folding and unfolding in silence in the pale, dimming moonlight, as though aware of him, as though tasting the air between them. The air thickened, and each breath coming slower, pressing closer, as if the fog itself were filling his lungs. The lights from the inn blurred, swallowed in the endless pale, dissolving into the haze like they were nothing more than faint impressions, the kind that flicker at the edges of memory just before disappearing altogether. Gray stood, his fingers grazing empty air where his compass should have been, moving as if on their own accord, searching for some kind of anchor. The pale light of the moon dimmed then, slipping away in rapid increments, as though something unseen were drawing it back, pulling it tighter into the sky until only a thin, dying glimmer remained. Gray wanted to turn back, to push himself toward where the inn's lights had been, but he was rooted, chest tightening, his right hand curling into a clawed, unnatural shape, seized beyond his control. This wasn't the only reason, though. The truth, the darker truth, was that there were no lights left to turn back to. They'd been eaten by the fog, leaving him here, alone, locked in a pale, suffocating murk that clung to everything and showed him nothing. Then there was silence, an agonizing silence. And then the whistle roared through the night like a bellow of some great and dreadful furnace, a sound too vast and terrible to be part of the world he knew. It had sharpened, a brutal noise cutting through the air with the force that felt pointed, purposeful. No longer tangled with the wind, it carried its own intent, a shriek with terrible precision that felt aimed solely at Gray, as if it could see him, as if it had been waiting for him all along. Ahead he saw it, a shifting silhouette. Perhaps it was more than one. Shifting silhouettes. Pierce's mocking voice hissed in his mind. Maybe you'll find the vengeful ghosts of the men you got killed. Gray felt his heart pounding against his ribs, a familiar, sickening pressure behind his eyes. Heat twisted through him, coiling like a serpent in his chest. Through the murky veil of fog, Gray caught fractured glimpses, flashes that shifted and vanished before his eyes could fully understand them. There was the sweep of something long and skeletal, ribs jutting wide, too wide, then gone as the mist coiled back over it. A shadowed form stretching toward him with alien purpose, then dissolving into shadow. It moved, barely a suggestion of limbs, folding and unfolding, a soundless predatory glide that left the air around it colder, sharper, as though it was drawing something vital out of the night itself, Sweat pricked Gray's brow. His breath came shallow and quick, each one a futile gasp as the whistle grew closer, louder, cutting through the pounding of his heartbeats. And then, with an abrupt, violent shrillness, the whistle sounded again, cutting through his mind like a scream. It was biting, deafening, sharper than any sound he had ever heard, tearing through his skull until he dropped to his knees, hands clamped over his ears. But it didn't stop. It twisted higher, ripping at his senses, blinding him with its pitch until his mind spiraled, barely holding on to the last thread of sanity. In the fog, a sudden glow burst forth, a sickly yellow-orange light searing through the mist. Gray, blinking through tears, his hands and knees pressed into the damp earth, his arms slack and helpless at his sides. Before him, a putrid, flaming visage leered to life, its twisting mouth and hollow eyes set in a fiery, mocking grin that contorted into a snarl. The face blazed with a fierce, unnatural light, wavering in the fog like some malevolent phantom. Behind it loomed a dark, towering shape, grim and ghastly, a figure shrouded in shadows that moved beneath the floating, flaming face. As Gray's vision steadied slightly, the figure with the ghastly head came into view, its movement toward him parting the fog just a bit. The face, that twisted, leering mask of light, seemed attached to the figure's shoulders, dreadful head atop an impossibly tall, thin frame that looked as though it had stepped from another world entirely. Its clothes were kissed with ghostly, sickly moonlight, tattered yet unmistakably marked by high collars and tarnished brass buttons. Remnants of epaulets, threadbare and sagging, barely clung to the shoulders, and his chest was crossed with worn straps and dulled buckles, glinting faintly in the flicker of the sinister face. The fog rolled over the figure's legs, swallowing its feet, causing it to hover above the ground, its stance rigid and unnatural, the coat hanging like drapery, flowing in the mist as though made of shadows themselves. Gray's mind whirled. He could see no human face, only the grinning, spectral light of the oversized, monstrous head, its eyes hollow and burning, its mouth twisted into that awful, mocking grin. A soldier of sorts, clad in spectral garb, wielding its own infernal axe face in one hand, watching Gray. Gray's breath caught. His chest tightened into a wince as the figure leaned in closer. Finally, a scream began to crawl up its way from Gray's chest, a raw, trembling sound gathering behind his teeth, desperate to escape. He felt it growing, coiling, pushing against his throat until he could hold it back no longer. Just as it was about to break free, and as his mouth unhinged to release the terror that surged through him, a hand, rough and cold as stone, clamped over his mouth, cutting the scream to a muffled gasp. The flaming spectral head with its grimacing snarl shifted to the side, and another face emerged in its place. Light from the jack-o'-lantern stretched across the figure's features, casting jagged shadows over a deep-lined scowl and piercing, narrowed eyes. He looked like something torn from nightmare. An apparition worn by wind and age, his face etched with fierce resolve and shadows clinging to his weathered skin. The man's expression appeared as ancient and unyielding as stone, his stance rigid, a lone sentinel against the darkness. The flickering glow twisted over his face, casting a deep shadow beneath his hat, and Gray felt a fresh spike of terror rooting him to the spot. The figure raised a finger to his own lips in a sharp, silent command, his gaze fixed on Gray, a warning to stay silent. The figure's fingers pressed firm against Gray's lips, filling his mouth with the taste of old iron and damp earth, silencing him utterly. Gray's eyes widened, the scream trapped and useless within him, as the fiery grin of the head loomed closer, its hollow eyes watching him with an unnatural patience, waiting for his every breath. Fear was beginning to be replaced by confusion in Gray as the figure, the man, standing before him, had something like protection in his cold gray eyes. The look was stern, but it wasn't malevolent. It was a weathered, wide-shouldered man holding a jack-o'-lantern aloft and telling Gray with his eyes to wait and don't move. The figure stowed its axe. Then the fog opened. It shifted, and Gray, with a huntsman's filthy finger pressed against his silenced lips, saw the end of the world in the flesh, standing there in the dark woods of Ashcroft. Through the murky veil of fog, Gray only caught fractured glimpses of another creature. Though Gray couldn't perceive intricate details, his mind could scantly perceive what it was seeing. The thing stood in the mist, not a stone's throw away from Gray and the huntsman, towering and elongated, its form a silhouette of impossible length, as if its body had been stretched, thinned by ages of dark purpose. There was the sweep of something long and skeletal, its midsection jutting wide, too wide, then gone as the mist closed back over it. It moved, barely a suggestion of limbs folding and unfolding, a soundless, predatory glide that left the air around it colder, sharper, as though it was drawing something vital out of the night itself. And there within what may have been a twisted ribcage, a faint glimmer, a low, dull glow that stuttered like the embers of a fire gone cold. But Gray was frozen in place, only able to let out a low, frightened whimper, barely audible, his limbs locked. The figure took no heed. He reached into a small worn pouch at his side and pulled out a small pot of dark, sticky honey, carefully drizzling it over the top of the glowing jack-o'-lantern. The rich scent mingled with the smoke as the huntsman tilted the pumpkin's lid to keep the flame alive, and without a word, he tossed it a few yards away. The hulking creature paused, its massive head lifting, nostrils flaring as it caught the scent. Gray watched transfixed as it shifted in the mist, its dark, many jointed limbs weaving as it lumbered forward toward the pumpkin, its terrible mouth opening wide as it approached. The creature bent low, and Gray could hear it sniffing, its twisted snout close to the ground. Then, with a sickening, wet, squelching sound, it began to devour the pumpkin, tearing it apart with feral hunger, its jaws clenching through rind and spilling seeds with grotesque slurps. Ray felt the heat arise behind his eyes again, too much to bear, and his breath stopped short. His vision spun, the nightmare of the scene spiraling around him, until his body finally gave way. The world tilted as his consciousness began to fade, slipping like water through his fingers. Dimly, he felt strong hands gripping him, pulling him up and slinging him over a broad shoulder, the fabric rough against his cheek. The huntsman pulled something large and strange from his bag as best he could while shouldering the weight of Gray's limp body. The creature stirred, its head shifting toward the two men. Then it began stalking toward them, crushing the remains of the pumpkin under some fetid, strange, and gangled limb. The huntsman whistle was unlike any instrument Gray had ever seen, or it would have been had he been conscious. A dark, twisting device of metal and wood that looked both delicate and strangely predatory. It was crafted from gleaming, tarnished brass, intricately carved with swirling lines that seemed to coil and knot like vines, their purpose unclear. The body of the whistle was elongated and narrow, with hollow chambers spaced unevenly along its length, each one drilled with thin channels that threaded into the next. Small valves crafted from a strange, polished bone protruded from the sides, clicking faintly when the huntsman moved it in his hand. At its base was a tiny bellows, barely the size of a coin, fitted tightly with a mechanism that would be wound by a thin brass key. The huntsman tried to twist the key on the whistle, but Gray's unconscious weight, slung over his shoulder, made it a clumsy effort. The whistle stuttered as he wound it, producing only a faint, ominous hum, lacking the force he needed. He adjusted his grip on Gray, attempting to balance him while forcing the key further, sending another trembling vibration through the device, as though it was almost, but not quite, ready. With a quick intake of breath, he blew it into the whistle, hoping to unleash the full shriek that could cut through the night. Instead, the air caught and tangled in the winding chambers, echoing back on itself, a sound muffled and warped. Frustration surged as he repositioned Gray, gripping the whistle tightly and blowing again, harder, forcing the air to spiral through the hollow valves until it finally burst into a piercing, fractured wail. The sound was uneven, distorted, and it carried weakly into the darkness, each fragment of the broken note trembling and then dying in the fog. As the fractured wail of the whistle pierced the air, the creature faltered slightly, its form wavering as though caught in a sudden, violent gust. The sound, though weaker than the others created by it tonight, hit like a force more than a noise, bending the creature's outline, warping its limbs and torso until it seemed to ripple, its body becoming insubstantial, shimmering with a strange, liquid translucence. Its form wavered, almost dissolving, as though it were made of water scattered in the air, each of its limbs bending and stretching unnaturally, the edge of it blurring, caught between one reality and the next. The creature staggered, its movements jerky and disoriented, each step a struggle to pull itself back together, but it recovered faster than the huntsman had anticipated. Suddenly, the dim light nestled within its ribcage flared, swelling into a blinding white-hot glow that cut through the fog like a blade. The creature let out a low, distorted groan that rumbled through the trees, a sound thick with anger and raw hunger. And then, with a terrible, furious lunge, it charged. The huntsman, with Gray slung across his back, fled deeper into the mist and the darkness of the forest, and the creature hungrily followed. The creature followed. Gray jolted awake, the world crashing back into sharp, agonizing focus as they broke through the thickest part of the fog. His senses reeled, assaulted by the cold bite of the night air and the relentless jarring of each step. Each time the huntsman took a step, Gray felt the sharp, jolting push of his shoulder against his ribs, his body bouncing painfully with every stride, each impact reverberating through him like the relentless pounding of a hammer. Gray felt the wind of something massive and close whipping past his ear in a near miss that stung his cheek with its ferocity. There was a sharp, wet, chomping sound, a grotesque gnashing that filled the air, and a smell that drifted over him, sickening and wrong. An acrid blend of honey, mashed pumpkin flesh, and rot. Thick enough to cling to his throat, he wanted to flinch away, but his body refused to respond. Limbs deadened, like he had been swallowed whole by the fog. Then a warmth spread over Gray's back, something almost alive, sinking into his skin and pulsing with a heat that felt both familiar and terribly foreign. It started small, a dull throb, but quickly spread, burrowing deeper, radiating through him like a fever. There was a sudden pull, a sickening weight that jerked against his back as if the huntsman had been forced to lurch forward to bear it. Gray's mind swam, senses scattering, and he caught a fleeting impression of the huntsman, grip tightening, hard as iron, as though he was anchoring Gray against something unseen that clawed and scraped. The warmth grew hotter, sharper, biting into him, and Gray realized with a dim, dreamlike horror that the heat was slick, spreading and wet, seeping through the fabric, gushing with a strange, terrible vitality. The huntsman's pace grew heavier, burdened, each stride a strained effort, as if bearing Gray's weight wasn't enough, as if he too could feel the press of something vicious and relentless clinging to them both. Gray wanted to cry out, to reach for whatever had him, but his voice wouldn't come. His body had gone limp, drifting in a darkness that seemed deeper than the fog, a darkness that pulsed along with the awful warmth that had settled, unbearably wrong, across his back. As the huntsman carried him through the thick fog, Gray's head lolled, his senses flickering in and out. The wound on his back throbbing with a terrible intensity, but adrenaline surged through him, sharpening his mind for a fleeting moment. A blurry memory snapping into place, a clearing he'd marked on his map, a place where the ground dipped into a narrow ravine. He managed a weak gasp, pulling himself just enough to murmur hoarsely, "Downhill. Take the ravine. The huntsman slowed, barely a hesitation, casting a glance at Gray in a moment that could scarcely afford. "Stay left." Gray's voice was barely more than a whisper, his head pressing against the huntsman's shoulder as he slipped in and out of lucidity. The huntsman paused for a heartbeat, doubt tugging at him as he glanced at the shadowed, treacherous terrain of the dark ravine ahead of them. Behind them, the creature's snarl grew closer, its heavy limbs crashing through the undergrowth, the sound of claws tearing through the earth and brush coming dangerously near. He could almost feel the creature's hot breath in the air, its growls reverberating through the fog. For a split second, the huntsman considered another route, something safer, but he forced the hesitation away, trusting his instincts and Gray's knowledge. The huntsman couldn't tell if the injured man was even coherent, but Gray's half-closed eyes held a glint of desperate clarity. With scarcely more than a grim nod, the huntsman instinctively adjusted his weight and angled his steps downhill into the dark mouth of the ravine. As gravity seized him, the huntsman took a quick, sharp turn left. His boots slipped as he shifted his weight, plunging further into the ravine. Gray's head lulled, his breaths shallow, but he managed a faint murmur, barely audible. "Main path. Unstable." As they pressed along the left side of the steepening ravine, the creature lunged forward, its massive limbs thundering against the forest floor, sticking close to the worn path that ran like a scar down the ravine's center. The huntsman barely crossed onto solid ground when Gray's warning proved true. A deep rumble echoed through the woods as the unstable earth, little more than a lattice of dead trees, stretched over the rocky depths, gave way. The ground collapsed beneath the beast, sending it crashing down with a snarling roar, its claws scrabbling in vain as it tumbled, barreling down the slope. Half buried in loose soil and twisted roots, the creature rolled like a grotesque, unnatural ragdoll, swallowed by the ravine's descent. The huntsman didn't linger. He hoisted Gray higher, casting one last wary glance back at the creature as it thrashed below, entangled in a mound of shifting earth and splintering roots at the ravine's base. Trusting Gray's insight had bought them precious time and distance, and though his pulse still raced, he felt a grudging gratitude and an unspoken bond settled between them. Gray blinked into consciousness slowly, a dull ache spreading from his back, throbbing deeper with each beat of his heart. The smell reached him first, earthy, metallic, sharp, a blend of damp stone, herbs, and something acrid. Blinking against the flickering lamplight, he looked in his surroundings. With a shudder, he realized he was underground, lying on a rough floor layered with worn animal pelts. Shelves jutted from the earthy walls, cluttered with strange relics, bundles of dried herbs, bones strung together in crude symbols, and scraps of parchment tacked up like trophies. Then Gray saw them, crude sketches of the creature he had glimpsed in the fog staring back at him, their jagged lines crawling over the parchment like scars etched in protest, each marking thick and slippery, infused with a terrible energy. Gray's eyes traced the charcoal smudges, each stroke like a remnant of a nightmare, as if the artist's hands had trembled while trying to capture something his mind could barely hold on to. Dark ink symbols surrounded the figure in frenzied loops and spirals, annotated in language Gray couldn't decipher, though their meaning felt uncomfortably clear. A warning, a binding, a desperate act of containment. A sharp electric pain radiated from the wound in his back, searing up his spine, and he clenched his jaw, forcing himself to look away. But the impression of the creature lingered, burning into his mind's eye. A long, skeletal shape stretched beyond any human proportion, ribs jutting out like broken claws, its hollow, twisted form disturbingly vivid even in these erratic smudges of charcoal. Gray shifted, trying to push himself up, his eyes landing on a shelf lined with pumpkins, some squat, others warped and stretched. These were no ordinary pumpkins. Their thick skins were scarred, hardened into a sinewy texture, with twisted stems jutting like gnarled fingers into the dim light. They almost seemed alive, like ancient heads born from the earth itself, faceless centuries, watching him as he gathered his bearings. "You're a blasted fool," came the huntsman's voice, rough and unrelenting from somewhere beyond the shelves. Gray's head swam, his gaze drifting over the room's strange contents. Each item seemed steeped in a sinister purpose, layers of dark intent woven into each makeshift charm and relic. "What in God's name were you doing out here on All Hallows Eve?" The huntsman continued, his tone sharp with frustration. "You're supposed to stay holed up at the Black Tree Inn, like the rest of them." Gray's gaze slid upward, catching on ward symbols gouged deep into the overhead beams, dark stains seeping into the wood, proof of years of relentless, ritualistic tracing. The marks were jagged, primitive, as though they drew their strength purely from the force of will. "Where?" Gray managed, his voice barely more than a rasp. "You're in my root cellar," the huntsman replied. "Safe enough for now, but we can't let our guard down." He stepped out from the shadows, the lantern casting harsh angles across his face, hollow eyes gleaming, his expression cut down with a fierce wariness. "Look, I don't mind helping folks in need," the huntsman grumbled, his voice gravelly, laced with a hint of disdain as he sized up Gray. "But what are you doing out there? Trying to serve yourself up like a lamb to slaughter? You're not some fool zealot, are you? Or some backwoods conjurer with rocks for brains?" He gave Gray a long, cutting look, shaking his head if he had seen 100 like him before, none of whom had lasted. "No," Gray croaked, his voice hoarse and unsteady. "I'm a cartographer." As Gray tried to sit up, a warm trickle slid down his back, and the sharp sting reminded him of the creature's claws, or teeth, or whatever had gouged through him. The pain was relentless, searing, but beneath it was something else, something he couldn't quite understand, as though it hadn't merely injured him, but infected him, leaving a dark thread of itself inside, coiling tighter with each breath. He shivered, his skin prickling in the dense, heavy air of the cellar, which seemed to press against him like a weight, resisting his attempts to rise. "You'll never be the same," the huntsman muttered, each word landing like a weight. "Best get that straight right now." He strode over, looking Gray up and down with an expression caught somewhere between pity and plain resignation. "I'm not here to hold your hand or make you feel better. We're aiming to keep you breathing. But that thing, it tore off more than just flesh, left its mark deep, and then some." He paused, eyes narrowing. "So don't expect any soft words or easy fixes. That's not what I do." Gray watched as the huntsman worked at a strange little station, a mixture of workshop and kitchen, cluttered with worn vials and powders of every strange hue, rough tools, and bones strung like makeshift charms. The huntsman's fingers moved deftly, grinding something in a small mortar, his other hand skimming over rows of dark jars and dried herbs, as if he were searching for just the right ingredient. Finally, he reached into a small cabinet carved into an earthen wall, pulling out a vial filled with a thick, dark liquid. Unscrewing the cap, he poured a splash into the mix, swirling it until the concoction thickened, its acrid scent filling the air, a smell as foul as it looked. But then, as if to soften the bitterness, he added a drop of honey, a delicate touch against the harshness of the other ingredients. He swirled the mixture with a calloused finger and held it out to Gray. "Here," he said gruffly, pressing the vial into Gray's hands. "Drink this." How am I still alive?" Gray stammered. "Some would say you aren't anymore, friend," the huntsman replied, his voice low and pitiless. Gray reached around to inspect the wound on his back, expecting to find torn fabric or flesh. Instead, he felt only his coat, whole, though damp and sticky. Confused, he flexed his shoulders and gingerly slipped out of the coat, wincing as his back throbbed anew with the pain. Yet the fabric was intact, merely stained with something black and viscous, drying in patches. He clenched a part of the coat in his hand, feeling the warmth and thickness of it seep between his fingers, and stared up at the huntsman, his throat tight with a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "Drink it now," the huntsman said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Gray eyed the thick, foul concoction with a grimace. A small gag escaped him before he could stop it. His eyes flicked from the sludge to the huntsman, then back down, as though the drink might somehow improve with a second look. With a resigned sigh, knowing he didn't have much choice, he raised the glass, steeling himself to take a quick, decisive gulp. But as he tipped the glass and tilted his head back, the sludge barely budged, sliding sluggishly, streaking its way down the foggy glass, inching toward his lips like it had a mind of its own. When the ooze was nearly at his mouth, Gray jerked his head back with a retching sound, his stomach already rebelling. "It smells like an outhouse," he muttered, his voice a tight whisper of horror. "You're not far off," the huntsman replied, deadpan. "But I did add some honey," he added with the first glint of what could be perceived as kindness. Gray steadied himself with a deep breath, pinching his nose tight, and raised the glass again, determined to finish it in one go. The sludge oozed ever so slowly, finally touching his lips. He forced himself to swallow, pushing down the thick, lumpy residue that clung unpleasantly to the roof of his mouth. Egads, that's the foulest thing I've ever tasted, he gasped, slamming the glass down and pacing around the room, trying to keep his stomach from revolting entirely. You'll start feeling a little better in a quarter hour. Maybe half, the huntsman said, eyeing the dredges left in the glass with a grimace. He took it by the rim, holding it at arm's length like even a whiff of the stuff might do him harm. After that, it'll get worse, the huntsman muttered, his voice laced with a grim sort of pity. He cast a sidelong glance at the fire, a flicker of something like regret crossing his weathered face. Moving towards the small fire crackling near the far wall, he crouched down and scooped a handful of fine ash, sifting it between his fingers as he brought it to the rim of the glass. That thing didn't hurt your body, mapmaker, he muttered, his voice low, more to himself than to Gray, as he began scrubbing the ash around the inside of the glass. It took a good clean chunk of your immortal soul itself. The gritty residue mixed with whatever foul remnants had clung to the sides, forming a paste that scraped off stubborn streaks of the viscous sludge. The huntsman worked with practiced efficiency, twisting his wrist to cover every inch of the interior. And this here, he muttered, eyeing the grimy glass, is about the best we've got to keep you from festering, so to speak. After a few moments, he poured out the sooty mixture, tapping the glass lightly against the ground to shake loose any lingering bits of ash. He gave the inside a final wipe with a coarse cloth he pulled from his coat pocket, inspecting it for any stubborn stain. Satisfied, he held the glass up to the flickering light, squinting at the rough cleanliness he'd managed. Because if it festers, he said, setting the glass back on the rough table with a solemn nod, that's a fate worse than any mortal death. You've been marked by the creature, and on this night, that mark is the most powerful. He glanced down at his hands, calloused and scarred. I can't tell you exactly how it works, only that I know it's true. Gray swallowed again, the bitter concoction settling like lead in his stomach. A question rose to his lips, but he held it back, seeing something in the huntsman's face he couldn't quite name. Something like pity. The huntsman's voice dropped to a low rumble, as if speaking more to himself than to Gray. Best say your prayers. Keep one eye on that door. If that wound of yours starts to feel cold, you let me know. You let me know right away. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, casting shadows that flickered and stretched, making the root cellar feel colder and darker than it had a moment before. Gray thought of Philadelphia, though even that felt like a place from another lifetime, foreign and impossibly distant. Hours passed in silence. Gray lay in uneasy silence, sleep a distant hope, as the dull ache from his back kept his nerves prickling awake. Across the root cellar, the huntsman moved with a quiet purpose, checking his equipment, loading weapons, laying out wards and charms in practice rhythm that filled the cellar with soft, metallic clinks and the scrape of a whetstone. Gray watched, his questions pressing against his mind, each one darker and heavier than the last. He wanted to ask about the creature itself, what it was, why it was, but each time he opened his mouth, the words caught, feeling too final, too dark. Finally, his voice broke the silence, latching onto something simpler. Why pumpkins? The huntsman paused, his hands stilling over a row of smooth, weathered stones, his eyes flicking up to meet Gray's. A faint smirk tugged at his mouth as he set down the stone. Don't rightly know for sure. For some reason, that thing's drawn to the flesh and rind of a good pumpkin, like a fish to a lure. He replied, voice low, his words weighed down with the certainty of hard-earned knowledge. I've been told it's the smell that does it. Something about that deep, earthy sweetness, especially when the pumpkin's just on the verge of decay. The huntsman said, a grim edge to his voice. But if you carve a face in the flesh and light a flame inside it, that's a pull even stronger. Like a wolf drawn to a fresh carcass, it gives off a kind of energy, like a spirit trapped inside. That thing can't resist them. Was that honey you poured on it? Gray asked, his voice wavering slightly with curiosity. It was, the huntsman replied, a touch of grim satisfaction in his tone. The only thing that abomination craves more than a nearly rotting jack-o'-lantern is something sweet. Got an insatiable tooth for it. So, when I combine the two, it's a lure it just can't resist. Unless it catches the scent of a mortal soul, of course. Gray's eyes drifted over the dim room, as if seeing it for the first time. Softened by the fire's glow, the huntsman's coat was draped over the back of a sturdy wooden chair beside the fire, its dark fabric worn and heavy, lined with small, strange charms, tiny bones and rusted bits of metal, each one carefully knotted to the fabric. Gray hadn't noticed them before, hadn't seen how they caught the light, casting sharp, delicate shadows onto the stone floor. His gaze moved to the cluttered shelves where knickknacks, crates, and weathered tools lay in rough heaps, their forms now clearer in the flickering light. A string of dried herbs hung from a low beam, casting ghostly shadows along the walls, their brittle leaves rustling faintly in the draught. A row of small glass jars lined one shelf, each filled with thick, dark liquids and powders that swirled faintly with the light, like dark, preserved storms. Gray's eyes continued to explore, settling on stacks of notebooks and loose-leaf journals piled high on a makeshift table. He noticed several strange volumes, their bindings brittle, half-rotted, with words scrawled in a language that looked almost German, though not entirely. Then he saw it, the huntsman's whistle, resting on a table beside another cluster of cracked, leather-bound journals and splayed parchments. It was a strange object he had only dimly registered before, drifting in and out of awareness during their frantic flight from the creature. It was sitting on a rough-hewn table beside the man's hand. Gray's stomach twisted as he noticed its true craftsmanship for the first time, catching glints from the fire and casting an odd, coppery glow. The dark, tarnished metal was engraved with winding symbols, lines that twisted, spiraled along its length in intricate, hypnotic patterns. The small bone valves glinted faintly, their polished surfaces gleaming like the worn edges of ancient teeth. The winding key at its base caught the light with each flicker of the flames, casting a faint glint into the room's dim corners. Then, as Gray examined the drawings on the wall more carefully, his attention snagged on something unusual. A map. His curiosity sparked, lifting the fog of weariness. "Wait, what's that?" he asked, a hint of energy returning to his voice. Is that a map? Who drew that?" His tone came out sharper than he had intended, almost demanding. The huntsman let out a long, knowing sigh, a faint smile tugging at the edges of his mouth. "That map maker is the work of Carl Dietrich. Brilliant man he was." Gray picked up on the past tense, his face reflecting the realization. But the hint of mystery sparked something deeper, a scholar's instinct that pulled him forward despite himself, his curiosity burning too hot to resist. The huntsman seemed to notice this, his gaze shifting slightly, softening. For the first time, he looked ready to let a fragment of his own story unfold. His posture relaxed, just enough to signal a small truce. "All right, mapmaker," he said, rising with a steady determination. "All right, mapmaker," he said, rising with a steady determination. "I'll gather us something to eat, and then I'll tell you about the Hessians, the beast, and what drove me to wander these woods with a strange whistle in the fog." The huntsman cleared his throat, letting the crackling fire fill the silence for a moment. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, his gaze distant as though shifting through layers of fog for memories long hidden. Gray waited, leaning forward slightly, feeling the stir of anticipation and a touch of impatience. Just as the huntsman began to speak, he hesitated. "Wait," he said, narrowing his eyes at Gray with a curious intensity. "What year is it for you?" Gray blinked, puzzled by the question. "It's 1788, nearly 1789. The huntsman gave a small nod. "Ah, very well," and then cleared his throat again. He settled back, the flickering light casting shadows over his lined face, giving him the appearance of someone straddling two worlds. "I was a hunter in this territory back in 1778. Earned myself a bit of a reputation, you see. Knew the lands, knew the game, the people." He paused, his eyes growing darker. "And sometimes, something else." Gray felt a chill creep over him, prickling the back of his neck. The huntsman's voice lowered, his gaze flickering back to the fire, as if he were watching the past play out in these flames. "In the spring of 78, as the war dragged on, the Hessians came through. German mercenaries hired by the British to bolster their numbers. But there was one particular regiment among them that was different. Within that regiment were two men, Otto Hendrik and Carl Dietrich." He took a slow, steady breath. "They were part of a unit that called themselves the Geisterjäger." Gray's eyebrows shot up, the term familiar despite the fog of fear that hung over him. "Ghost hunters?" A hint of approval sparked in the huntsman's eyes. "Aye, mapmaker. Very good. Those two didn't come here for battlefields and bayonets. They came with a special purpose, and particular training and gear. not to hunt for men, but for things that lurk beyond the firelight. His voice lowered, his eyes narrowing. They'd been sent to investigate occurrences, strange fates befalling British soldiers in these woods, cases that couldn't be explained by any human means. Gray's pulse quickened, his eyes widening as he leaned in, caught up in the huntsman's words, drawn as much by the huntsman's conviction as by the weight of his tale. The firelight flickered in fierce arcs over the huntsman's face, highlighting the shadowed lines in his jaw, the deep grooves of his brow, marking him as someone who had witnessed the edge of things, as though he himself were straddling the threshold of worlds he'd rather forget. The huntsman's voice took on a rough edge as he continued, eyes fixed on the fire. Otto and Carl weren't men who trusted easily, least of all a colonial like me. But the first time I came across them, they were lost deep in these woods, caught off guard by something darker than they'd been trained for. He paused, the flickering light casting shadows over his face. They were on the brink of losing their lives, maybe even worse. But I knew these lands, knew how to hunt, gave them shelter right here in this root cellar, and we survived the night. Barely. He fell silent, the weight of the memory thickening the air. After that, they saw the value in an alliance, and kind of respect grew between us, then trust and brotherhood. They shared much of their Geisterjäger knowledge with me, teaching me their strange ways as I taught them how to track and hunt on this land, how to survive these woods. They taught me about the pumpkins, the sweets, the coats and masks, everything. But I'll take credit for carving the gourds into jack-o'-lanterns. A faint smile crossed his face. Picked that trick up from an Irish traveler and thought I'd give it a go. Worked like a charm. But it was Otto who thought to douse them in honey. It worked even better. Gray interrupted, unable to hold back. Wait, what do you mean? The coats and masks? The huntsman paused, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze before he continued. The coats and masks. He leaned back, running a hand over his weather jacket as though seeing it anew. The Geisterjäger had a method, you see. These coats and masks, they weren't just for warmth or to show loyalty in uniform. They were made to hide something more vital. Gray leaned in, eyes widening. They were a costume of sorts, the huntsman said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. These coats and masks act as camouflage for the soul. When the dark things in these woods caught sight of a soul, it shone to them like a torch in the night, bright, vivid, and impossible to miss. But in these coats and in these masks, woven and prepared in their strange ways, they hid the brightness, kept the hunters in the shadows where they belonged. It allowed them to pass through the forest unseen by most of what lurks in the night. He tapped the edge of his coat, even saved my skin more than once. Gray absorbed the weight of it, the purpose behind every garment and relic in the root cellar taking on a new, eerie significance. The huntsman's expression shifted, something grim but almost reverent crossing his face. In fact, here, he rose from his seat, moving over to the darkened corner of the cellar. Gray watched as he lifted a strange, square box from the shelf, a hefty, ornate thing with a dull metallic sheen, darkly tarnished but intricately detailed with carvings that twisted and coiled like the vines of a forgotten forest. The box looked like it might have served as a large brick in a weight alone. but it bore no clear purpose other than decoration. Its engraving matched the strange etching on the whistle, giving them a kinship Gray couldn't ignore. The huntsman set the box aside carefully, revealing a folded coat beneath it. It was similar to his own, dark, thick, and worn. This one was differently adorned, the symbols stitched across it more elaborate and haunting, each one a dark tangle of thread woven into the heavy wool. Gray could almost feel the weight of its history emanating from the fabric. Then, from the narrow drawer just beneath, the huntsman retrieved 2 masks. They were unnerving things, each crafted from the same tarnished metal as the whistle and the box, with hollow eyes and faces that seemed half snarling, half smiling, frozen in expressions neither alive nor dead. Each had patterns that curled like shadows across the metal, details so intricate they almost seemed to shift in the flickering light of the fire. "These belong to them," the huntsman said quietly, his voice almost a murmur. He handed one of the masks to Gray, letting him feel the surprise weight of it. Gray took the mask, feeling its chill seep into his palms, its gaze blank but somehow potent, like it held stories only whispered in the darkest corners of the forest. "I hate how it feels on my face," the huntsman muttered, casting a look at the mask in his hands. "Carl would have scolded me for not wearing it." Gray hesitated, watching the huntsman closely. "So, what happened to them?" The huntsman's expression darkened, the shadows deepening around his eyes. "We chased the creature, hunted it right to the edge of its lair. But that lair's protected, hidden with some kind of hex magic. It can only be found, truly found, when the veil thins on All Hallows' Eve. And that's also when the beast is at its most powerful on this mortal coil." The huntsman paused, glancing at the mask and the whistle on the table, as though seeing ghosts from the past. "There was a terrible battle that night. We did everything we could. Otto, he told me he'd severed a piece from the creature, a vital piece, maybe the head. But the beast still lived. And then we got separated." He cleared his throat, his voice thickening as he struggled to keep steady. "And well, Otto and Carl, they just..." Tears welled up in the huntsman's eyes, his gaze shifting to the floor. Anyhow," he finished, fumbling to change the subject, but failing to mask the loss in his voice. Gray stayed silent, the weight of loss hanging in the air. The huntsman went on, his tone edging with frustration. "See, without them here, I'm left with all this knowledge and all these tools they left behind, but I can't read German. Can barely read English either, if you don't want to know the truth. I just do what I can to stay alive. Slow the beast down, spare a few lives, like your dumb hide." He forced a half smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Then, with a rough laugh, he picked up the strange box. "And this was their pride and joy. Had it shipped all the way from Germany. They swore this box would be the key to find the monster's lair, no matter where it moved. But here it is, sitting here, a big, useless hunk of metal I've been using as a bookstand." A long pause settled between them, heavy with everything left unspoken. The fire crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows that played over the box on the table besides the huntsman. Its worn brass edges glinted faintly, catching the light just enough to reveal faint, etched words in an ornate script, partially worn with age. The letters curled in a way that hinted at something foreign, a language Gray could barely make out but instantly recognized, like the remnants of an old magic locked away under layers of dust and time. "Huntsman," Gray said quietly but triumphantly, his voice steady. "I'm fluent in German." The huntsman's eyes widened, a glimmer of hope mingled with disbelief. Without a word, Gray stepped forward. Crossing to the table, he ran his fingers over the box's surface, feeling the faint ridges and grooves worn into the brass. "The instructions, they're right here, written on the thing itself." His hand moved with a newfound confidence, tracing through the raised letters and symbols. Carefully, he pressed against one side, finding the hidden latch that gave way with a soft click. He turned his attention to a small metal panel on the underside, pushing it in with a deliberate, gentle pressure, then releasing it to reveal a slender lever tucked just beneath. Gray glanced back at the huntsman, whose brows had drawn together, watching him with guarded anticipation. Returning to the box, Gray slid the lever, feeling the soft resistance as he guided it along the groove. Finally, he pressed down on the raised brass dial near the top, hearing a series of faint clicks and whirs as the box seemed to come alive in his hands. With a final tense twist, the box's sides released, unfolding like petals opening on a strange mechanical flower. It transformed, metal shifting and reshaping with an elegance that seemed almost impossible for such a dense, compact object. The faint hum grew louder as intricate gears and hidden panels slid seamlessly into place, revealing an object unlike any Gray had ever seen. It gleamed in the firelight, its brass casing etched with the same curling foreign script and adorned with the filigree pattern that matched the whistle and the masks. The huntsman stared at it, mouth half opened, his rough features softened by the mix of awe and disbelief. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. Gray's face lit with a wide grin, satisfaction radiating from him. He was just about to say something, unable to contain his excitement, when suddenly Gray's grin vanished, replaced by a look of pure terror as the entire cellar shuddered, dust and dirt cascading from the ceiling. Before he could process it, the walls rattled again, harder this time, causing jars and relics to tumble from their shelves. The new strange relics scattered across the table, tipping precariously. The door above ground groaned and shuddered as something massive threw itself against it, then slammed into it again with an even greater force. Gray clutched at his back, feeling a deep-rooted instinct to protect the wound, but this time the reflex was pure fear. "Is it the creature?" he stammered, his voice thin and shaky. The huntsman was already on his feet, moving swiftly around the cramped cellar, gathering up vials and weapons he had prepared earlier that evening. He shot Gray a grim, sideways look. "That," he muttered, his tone filled with grim certainty, "would be Otto and Carl." Gray's eyes widened. "Otto and Carl? But you said they were dead." The huntsman snatched up his own coat and strapped a knife to his belt with a weary sigh. "I never said they were dead," he replied, his voice steady but tense. "Now grab that coat and mask. Put them on. You'll find a very special weapon in Carl's chest there. Be careful with it, and make sure to hold it steady." Gray hesitated only a second before throwing the coat over his shoulders, the fabric heavier and colder than he'd expected, but it fit as though it had been waiting for him all along. The mask followed, the rough leather pressing close, masking his own rapid breaths. The huntsman locked eyes with him as he tightened a strap on his own gear. I'm warning you, map maker. This won't be easy. The huntsman lowered his mask slowly, his eyes narrowing as he listened to the rumbling outside. And they seem angrier than usual. With one final thunderous boom, the door above jarred again, wood splintering, and the cellar seemed to hold its breath, the silence thicker and colder than the fog outside. And this tale, Night Traveler, is to be continued. You have braved another chapter of the legend of the Whistling Huntsman, and yet the darkness of Ashcroft's woods grows ever deeper. Can Gray withstand what he's seen, or will the mark left upon him by that ghastly creature fester into something far worse? And what of the huntsman? And what of our new friends, Otto and Carl? But those questions, Night Traveler, shall remain shrouded until next we meet. So, until we meet again, until the shadows grow just a little too long, and the familiar starts to feel oh so strange, remember, there's always something darker still, and rest assured, I'll be watching.